Okay, so I'm just going to assume that you by now know what you've clicked on. This is my second rebuttal in my debate with Dustin, aka Non-Alchemist, on whether horrendous suffering disproves God. For a link to all of the videos in our debate, check the playlist in the description. So I want to start by once again thanking Dustin for another thought-provoking rebuttal. In my second rebuttal, I'll follow the same format as my first rebuttal. First, general remarks. Second, I'll look at the three premises that I've objected to and how Dustin has responded. And then third, some brief closing remarks. So general remarks. First, Dustin believes that logical forms of the problem of evil are no more difficult to defend than standard deductive arguments. That's because all he needs to do is show that his premises are more plausibly true than false. But what Dustin hasn't done is interact with any of the reasons that I've given for suggesting that he does in fact have a higher burden of proof. Recall the necessary cats example that I gave in my first rebuttal. It's a lot more difficult to prove that cats exist necessarily than it is to prove that cats exist simplicator. Part of the reason for this is that bare possibility works to defeat premises that purport to be necessarily true. The point is just that in general, necessary propositions take more work to get to the status of more plausibly true than not. And in Dustin's case, he hasn't come close to meeting this standard, and we'll see more why in the next section. My second general remark is that according to Dr. Timothy McGrew, we don't just need to have premises that are more plausibly true than not. We need the conjunction of the premises to be more plausibly true than not. I won't go into much detail in this video why that's the case. If you're interested, check the description. But the point is this. Dustin needs to up his standards. It's not enough to show that his premises are more plausibly true than not. He needs to show that the conjunction of his premises are more plausibly true than not. All right, let's move on to the good stuff. So premise one, as a reminder, the first premise says, necessarily, if God exists, finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God realize their deepest good. In my previous rebuttal, I pointed out that appeals to intuition in defense of this premise won't work. We need an argument. What argument does Dustin provide? Well, he offers a consideration he believes supports premise one.
The deepest good of finite persons will clearly be realized in relation to a goodness personified in some capacity. And the phrase, ever more fully experience the reality of God, is meant to encompass those potential capacities.
So the problem here is that premise one doesn't follow from this consideration. Even if our deepest good is connected to God in some way, it doesn't follow from this that our deepest good is an ever-deepening experience of God. Consider the following. So Dr. Andrew Cullison has argued that self-sacrifice for another is our deepest good. This good is clearly tied to God in some way. God is disposed toward sacrifice, yet it's not the good that Dustin has in mind. I suppose that there are like 2 points that this counterexample helps make. So first, Dustin's argument is a non sequitur. His first premise doesn't actually follow from this consideration. Consider this the first undercutting defeater. Second, we have a competing good that Dustin must rule out as a possibility. Consider this a second undercutting defeater. In the words of a friend of mine, suffice it to say, I'm not too impressed with Dustin's defense of his first premise. What about his second premise? Now, actually, before we move on, this is another quick reminder that our Apologetics ministry is currently operating at a net deficit each month. If you are financially able and would like to support our work of exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief, head over to our Patreon to pledge your support. We have some awesome gifts and things that we give you in return for your support. The link to our Patreon is in the description. All right, let's move on to premise 2. And let's get a quick reminder of what premise 2 says. Necessarily, if God exists, the prevention of horrific suffering does not prevent there being finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God. So in my first rebuttal, I challenged Dustin to provide us with a strong argument in defense of this premise. How did Dustin fare in his second rebuttal? He provides a thought-provoking quote from Schellenberg. In the quote, Schellenberg argues that premise 2 follows from 2 simple considerations. A, God's goodness is inexhaustible, and B, we humans are limited in all our capacities. From A and B, it's supposed to follow that no one's ever deepening experience of God would need to involve horrific suffering. The problem, as I see it, is that this is clearly a non sequitur. Premise 2 does not actually follow from A and B. It could be the case, as in possibly the case, for example, that someone, call him Richard, is limited in his capacity to deepen his experience of God. So for such a person, God's inexhaustible goodness, combined with their limited capacities, doesn't actually guarantee an ever-deepening experience of God. It could be the case that for this individual person's psyche, they need to experience something jolting, something that will motivate them to dive into God's goodness. So premise 2 doesn't actually follow from A and B, seems to me. Moreover, in my previous rebuttal, I mentioned the work of Marilyn McCord Adams, and she argues that those that experience horrific suffering can identify with God in a way that those that don't experience horrific suffering can't. How does Dustin reply to this? So he says two things, actually. First, he says that adding Christian auxiliary hypotheses to bare theism will lower the prior probability of the overall hypothesis. But this is actually a red herring. Whether or not the Christian story has a low prior probability is a very interesting question, but it's simply not relevant to the truth of any premise in Dustin's argument. Second, he simply asserts that his argument works just as fine against Christianity.
More importantly, though, my general defenses of this argument apply just as easily to Christianity as they do to bare theism.
A couple things in reply to this. So first, his defense of this premise is a non sequitur, as I've just shown, so it doesn't apply at all. And then secondly, Dustin is yet again begging the question. He doesn't even interact with the reasoning. He just claims that his argument is untouched. But what Dustin would actually need to do or argue is that, one, it's impossible that horrendous suffering can lead to identification with God, or two, it's impossible that identification with God could contribute to a deeper experience of God. And I don't see how he could possibly defend either proposition. Now, lastly, I mentioned empirical evidence from people like Viktor Frankl that claim to have experienced God at a deeper level as a result of undergoing horrific suffering. Astonishingly, Dustin hand waves away this empirical evidence. He says that it doesn't matter what people claim, all that matters are his arguments. Well, once again, I've shown that his argument is a non sequitur, but what's really problematic here is that Dustin is hand waving away empirical evidence that contradicts his thesis. This is not the way to do philosophy, and it's not the way to have a debate. Needless to say, I'm pretty disappointed with Dustin's defenses of his first and second premises. But how about premise 4? Let's get yet another quick reminder of the way that this premise is phrased. For, necessarily, if God exists, there is horrific suffering, only if its prevention would prevent there being finite persons who realize their deepest good. This premise was originally defended by an appeal to divine empathy. In reply, I pointed out that God is going to respond compassionately to his empathetic knowledge, but his compassion is going to be consistent with reason. And reason might dictate that there are great goods like soul building that are distinct from our deepest goods, but that nevertheless morally justify horrific suffering. And God, being perfectly rational, will not ignore these great goods. So in reply, Dustin argued that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God. And I made 3 replies to this. We'll now go through and see how Dustin responded to my 3 replies. First, I argued that it's highly contested whether all greatest goods are already contained in God. It's quite dubious, for example, that God exemplifies the great good of forgiveness prior to creating anything. Dustin responds to this by claiming that my view has a nasty consequence. It makes creation necessary. In reply, this consequence only follows if we make the 2 following assumptions. 1, there is a singular best possible world, and 2, God must do one of the best things that he can. So both of these assumptions can actually be rejected. Most of the theists that I know, including myself, deny the first assumption. We don't believe that there is a singular best possible world. And I know several Christian philosophers that deny the second assumption. A classic example is Dr. Robert Adams' paper entitled, "Must God Create the Best?" But the point here is this. If Dustin wants to say that my view actually has this nasty consequence, he can do that, but he needs to do the hard work of showing both of the assumptions that I mentioned are true. The second reply I made to Dustin's claim that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God was that exemplifying virtue is greater than merely being sort of disposed toward virtue. Dustin makes 2 responses. First, he says that this means God is lacking in a fundamental way. In reply, lacking X doesn't entail being defective. After all, God lacks the ability to sin, but it's no defect of God's that he can't sin. Similarly, while God lacks the ability to exemplify some virtues without creating, this is no defect on his end, since it is simply impossible to exemplify such virtues without creating. Second, he says that the Trinity is supposed to be, quote, the deepest possible relationship, and it doesn't involve any evil. So first, even if the Trinity is the deepest possible relationship, whatever that means, it doesn't follow that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God. For this reason, I'm a bit confused as to why this consideration is even being raised here. Now, second, I don't know what's actually meant by deepest possible relationship. Does it mean that it's like the most loving relationship or the most valuable? I mean, maybe that's right. But again, how is this supposed to be a problem for my view? The third reply that I made to Dustin's claim that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God was that even if we accept his claim, he needs to rule out the following. It seems possible that a world containing a profuse array and diversity of goods, together with their accompanying evils, would be better than a world containing only God, God's single model of the relevant goods, and no suffering. Dustin needs to rule out this possibility for his argument to succeed. So far as I can see, he made no reply to this at all. My three responses to Dustin's claim remain on pretty solid ground. Hence, I think that we have very good reason to think that premise 4 is not just unsupported, but actually false. Finally, Dustin switches gears and wields a highly controversial moral principle in support of premise 4.
Only the sufferer's own benefit could justify a perfect God's permission of unwanted, undeserved suffering.
The problem here, and this is kind of like a running theme at this point, is that premise 4 doesn't actually follow, even if we accept this controversial moral principle. Dustin has presented yet another non sequitur. The fact is, the greatest goods can still benefit the sufferer. Acts of courage, for example, can help create a courageous character. That's a direct benefit to the sufferer. So in other words, this new moral principle could be true while premise 4 is false. At the very least, Dustin needs to show that accepting his moral principle entails the truth of his premise. And I don't think he's going to be able to do that. In closing, Dustin has provided several fallacious arguments in support of his three key premises. His arguments are either non sequiturs, they're red herrings, or they're literally just flat out question begging. Dustin has not come close to showing that the conjunction of his necessary premises are more plausibly true than not. And unless he can miraculously turn things around in his 5-minute closing statement, Dustin has lost this debate.